The last man who called Duke Caedric Blackthorne a grieving fool was found the following morning seated upright in his own study chair, his correspondence neatly stacked beside him, his wine untouched, and every nerve in his body shattered beyond repair. No wound, no blood. Just a man who had spoken the wrong words to the wrong person and somehow survived the encounter, if surviving meant waking each day wishing he hadn't. That was 3 years ago. Since then, no one in Blackthorne Dominion had made the mistake of confusing the Duke's silence for weakness. Silence, they had learned, was simply what came before the verdict. Stay close, because the woman who finally dared to look into those eyes without flinching, she's about to change everything he thought he owned. The debt collectors arrived at dawn, which was the cruelest hour for such things. Lysandra heard them before she saw them, the grind of iron-rimmed wheels over the frozen rut of the lane, the flat percussion of boots hitting ground with the particular authority of men who knew the law was on their side. She was already dressed. She had not slept. The candle on the table had burned itself to a waxy stub sometime around the 3rd hour of morning, and she had sat across from it watching the flame negotiate with the dark, the way she had spent most of the past 6 months negotiating with numbers that refused to cooperate. She pulled back the warped shutter with 2 fingers and looked out. 3 men. A cart with iron brackets bolted to the sides, designed not for carrying goods but for cataloging them, the kind of vehicle that arrived at a household to measure what remained before deciding what could be taken. The lead collector wore a clerk's coat with a Valeswood estate seal pinned at his lapel, which meant he was not here on behalf of some itinerant moneylender. He was official. He was sanctioned. And he had ridden 2 hours before sunrise to make certain she understood that. Lysandra let the shutter fall back. She crossed the small room to the doorway of the inner chamber and checked on her father. Aldrich Vale lay under 2 quilts that had long since lost their original color. He was asleep, though his sleep was the brittle kind that looked more like exhaustion pretending to be rest. His breathing was shallow but steady. The fever had broken 4 days ago. The physician who had ridden out from the nearest market town, a pinched, practical man who charged for every minute he spent outside his own walls, had told her that Aldrich needed warmth, rest, and no disturbances of any kind. He had said this while accepting her last coin purse and departing before the ink on his invoice was fully dry. She pulled the inner door closed softly. Then she walked to the front of the cottage, squared her shoulders inside her wool coat, and stepped out to meet the men who had come to take everything that remained of her family's name. The lead collector's name was Duro. He told her this without being asked, with the sort of flat efficiency that suggested he had introduced himself outside hundreds of doorways just like this one and considered the act more formality than courtesy. Lysandra Vale, he said, reading from his ledger without looking up. Daughter of Aldrich Vale, formerly account clerk of the Valeswood estate under the late steward Karen. Outstanding debt to the estate trust in the amount of 462 silver marks, secured against property holdings identified as the Vale Cottage and surrounding parcel, totaling to— "I know what I owe," she said. Duro looked up then. He had the eyes of a man who had learned not to notice people as people, only as line items. He assessed her the way his assistants were already assessing the cottage, cataloging what was usable, what was damaged, what was worth the trouble of loading. "Then you'll know," he said, "that the final notice period elapsed 8 days ago." "I know that too. The estate trust has authorized seizure of the property and its contents to satisfy the debt." "On what basis," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, "was the debt itself validated?" "My father's records show the estate received payment through the autumn collection cycle. Receipts exist. I've submitted copies twice to the trust office and received no response either time." Duro blinked. This was not the part of the script he was accustomed to encountering. Most people at this stage either wept or threatened. Very few cited documentation. "The trust accounts were audited and certified," he said, after a pause that was slightly too long to be comfortable. "Audited by whom?" "By the estate's appointed magistrate." "The same magistrate who certified the original debt?" The pause this time was longer. One of the assistants had stopped moving. The other glanced at Duro and then looked away, which told Lysandra what she needed to know about how much loyalty existed between these 3 men when the conversation turned complicated. "Miss Vale," Duro said, and his tone shifted into something that was not quite a threat but was not quite not one either. "The legality of the debt is not a matter for this conversation. This is a collection proceeding. If you wish to contest the underlying documentation, you are entitled to file an appeal with the Dominion Magistracy in Ashford," she said. "I know. The filing fee is 40 marks, which is approximately 40 marks more than I currently possess. So let's stop pretending that Avenue exists for people like me and talk about what's actually happening here." Duro closed his ledger. Not because he was done with it, because he wanted both hands free, which was a small and deliberate signal. "What's actually happening," he said quietly, "is that you have until the end of this hour to remove any personal effects you intend to keep, and then we will begin the inventory. Your father's medical equipment will be noted separately. We are not unreasonable people." Lysandra stood in the cold and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was the specific sensation of watching a door close on every reasonable option simultaneously, the moment when a person understands that the systems designed to protect them were never designed for them at all. She had felt it before. When the estate had dismissed her father 2 years ago on grounds that everyone understood were manufactured. When the debt notice had arrived 3 months later, figures inflated past anything a man of Aldrich's salary could have accumulated honestly. When the neighbors who had known her family for 15 years began finding reasons not to meet her eyes in the market, there was a specific kind of loneliness in discovering that justice was not blind. It simply looked away. "I need 2 hours," she said. "1. My father cannot be moved without preparation. The physician's orders." 1 hour, Miss Vale. We'll wait outside." She went back inside. She stood in the middle of the cottage for approximately 30 seconds, doing nothing at all. It was not paralysis. She had learned the difference. Paralysis was when the mind refused to engage. This was something else. The moment before a person decides what kind of person they are going to be when there are no good options left. Then she went to the table, moved aside the burned-out candle, and pulled from beneath the floorboard beneath it the thing she had been protecting for 6 months with a ferocity she had told no one about. Her father's ledger. Not the official one. Not the copy submitted to the trust. The real one. The one Aldrich had kept hidden in the lining of his traveling coat for 3 years before his health had forced him to retire. The one he had pressed into her hands the night the fever crested and his mind had briefly, terribly cleared. "Don't let them have this," he had told her. His voice had been barely there. "What's in here is bigger than us. Bigger than the estate. If the right person saw it—" He had stopped. His eyes had closed. If the right person saw it, it would destroy people who believe they're untouchable. She had not opened it for 2 weeks after that. She had been afraid of what it meant. She had been afraid that knowing would make her responsible for it. She opened it now, not to read it. She had memorized its contents in the months since, but to confirm that it was still real, still there. The columns of figures in her father's cramped hand, the dates, the names, the discrepancies between what had been collected from tenant families across the Dominion and what had been recorded in the official accounts. Hundreds of families, years of systematic overcollection, debts manufactured and enforced through the same machinery that was sitting outside her door right now. And at the end of the ledger, in fresher ink, 3 names that recurred across every irregular transaction. Lord Malrec Blackthorne, Lady Seraphine Ashcroft, and a third name, the estate administrator who had signed every document, authorized every seizure, and ensured that the records showed only what the trust wanted them to show. She put the ledger inside her coat, against her ribs, where she could feel it. Then she went to help her father prepare to leave the only home she had known. Mum, the man came 2 days later. She had moved her father to the widow Bessel's house on the edge of the village, a cramped kindness that Bessel had offered with the specific generosity of someone who had themselves once needed it. Lysandra slept on a narrow bench near the fire and woke each morning to the sound of someone else's household and the weight of a situation with no visible exit. She was returning from the well when she saw the horse. It was not the kind of horse that appeared in this village. Kalen's Cross was a working community, farm animals, draft stock, the occasional traveling merchant's unremarkable gelding. This animal was different in the way that certain things are different, not because they are decorated, but because everything about their bearing communicates a different category of existence. Dark coat, almost black in the winter light. Built for distance, not display, but carrying it with the unconscious authority of something that has never been asked to apologize for what it was. The man standing beside it was speaking to Harwick, the village innkeeper, with his back to her. He was not wearing colors, no estate crest, no rank insignia. A coat of dark wool, well made but understated, the kind of clothing worn by someone who could afford better and had chosen not to be noticed. Tall, broad through the shoulder. He held himself with the stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was more effective than motion in most situations. Harwick glanced up and saw Lysandra. The expression that crossed his face was the specific combination of uncertainty and relief that appeared when a man had been asked a question he was not sure he should answer and had just been given an excuse not to answer it. "Miss Vale," Harwick said, "this gentleman was asking about you." The man turned. She registered his face in pieces, the way the mind processes something unexpected. First the structure of it, sharp and uncompromising, the jaw set like something carved from material that didn't soften with age. Then the eyes, which were gray and direct, and looking at her with an attention so complete it was almost physical. Not the way men usually looked at women in a village square. Not with want, exactly, though something in it was adjacent to want. More like the way a person looked at a problem they had spent considerable time calculating and had just located in an unexpected place. He was perhaps 35. The lines at the corners of his eyes were not from smiling. "Miss Lysandra Vale," he said. His voice was low and even. "I've been told you're a difficult woman to arrange a conversation with." "I've been told the same thing," she said, "usually by people who want something." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one. "Fair enough," he said. "My name is Caed. I'm a landowner in the area. I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you privately, if you're willing. It will take approximately 20 minutes of your time, and if at the end of it you tell me to leave, I will." "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that requires privacy," he said. "And for what it's worth, I already know about the debt collection. I already know about your father. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you. I'm here because I believe you have something I need, and I have something you need, and I'd like to see if those two things can be arranged productively." She studied him. He let her study him, which was itself a kind of information. Men who intended to intimidate rarely held still for scrutiny. 20 minutes, she said. They sat across from each other in the back room of the inn, which Harwick vacated with the speed of a man who understood when discretion was being purchased. The man who called himself Caed folded his hands on the table with the patience of someone who had learned to let silence do preliminary work. "Your father," he said, "kept records. Not the official ones, the ones he hid." Lysandra said nothing. "I'm not guessing," he said. "I know they exist because I've been trying to locate them for 8 months. Your father worked for an estate whose accounts were corrupted in a specific pattern that I've traced across 4 other properties in this dominion. The same signature, the same mechanism, the same result. Families destroyed, land transferred, debt manufactured to justify the transfer." He paused. "I believe your father recognized it and documented it before he was removed. What's your interest in this?" "The corrupted accounts belong to an estate that falls within my jurisdiction," he said. "The people running the scheme believe they've made themselves untouchable. I need evidence that proves they haven't. And in exchange—" "The debt is erased," he said. "All of it. The property returned. Your father's medical care covered for as long as necessary." He said this without drama, the way a person named a price who was accustomed to having prices named and met. "And your father's name is formally cleared of any implication in the irregularities." She felt something tighten in her chest. Not from the offer, from the precision of it. He had named everything that mattered in the exact order of its importance to her, which meant he had studied her situation with a thoroughness that was either professional or obsessive. "You could have contacted me through a magistrate," she said, "or through whatever administrative office you claim to represent. Why come yourself?" "Because magistrates talk," he said. and because the people I'm investigating have resources inside those offices. This conversation needs to have happened between two private individuals in a village where no one significant pays attention. And the proposal. He looked at her directly, no evasion in it. I need the records delivered in a manner that cannot be dismissed as circumstantial. Evidence presented by a private citizen can be discredited in ways that evidence presented by a wife of the investigating party cannot. The silence that followed had texture. You're proposing marriage, she said. A legal arrangement, he said, documented, binding, with terms that protect you independently of the outcome. He did not look away. I understand this is not a normal offer. I'm not pretending it is. If you tell me it's offensive, I'll hear that. But I want you to understand what I'm actually offering before you decide. Lysandra looked at the man across the table. She was 24 years old. She had a dying father, a coat with a hidden ledger sewn into the lining, and approximately 6 weeks before the Widow Bessel's charity ran into its natural limits. She had spent 6 months watching every legitimate avenue close, one by one, with the relentless consistency of a plan being executed by people who had never expected to encounter resistance. She was not naive. She understood that a man who arrived in a village without colors, asking a ruined woman to marry him for evidence, was not a simple landowner. But she also understood something that years of watching her father's meticulous records had taught her. The people who built systems of exploitation did so in the confidence that the exploited had no leverage. They were correct, almost always. Almost. I want the terms in writing, she said, before anything else. The shadow that was not quite a smile crossed his face again. I expected that, he said. She married him 4 days later. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a local records official rather than any ceremonial authority, and witnessed by Harwick and the widow Bessel, both of whom wore the expressions of people trying to decide whether they were watching something wise or catastrophic. Her father had been told only that she was marrying a man of means who had agreed to resolve the debt. Aldrich had looked at her for a long time from his pillows. Is he a good man? He had asked. She had thought about the way Cade had sat across the table from her with his hands folded, naming her vulnerabilities with the calm accuracy of someone who had inventoried them from a distance. The way he had met every question directly. The way he had not once, in 4 days of document review and legal arrangement, attempted to use the power differential between them as a tool of pressure. I don't know yet, she had said, but I think he's an honest one. The carriage that came for them after the ceremony was not what she had expected, not because it was elaborate, though it was in the understated way that spoke of quality chosen without the need for display, but because of what accompanied it. 3 outriders in dark livery. A footman who addressed the man beside her not as sir or mister, but with the precise deferential stillness of someone who had been trained to serve a specific category of person. The kind of person who did not need to announce their rank. The carriage moved north through the winter landscape, and Lysandra sat across from her new husband and watched him read correspondence with the focused attention of a man for whom this was simply an extension of work. He had said almost nothing since the ceremony, not unkindly, simply as though the silence between them was a reasonable space to occupy while both of them adjusted to a new set of facts. After perhaps an hour, she spoke. Where are we going? He looked up from his correspondence, met her eyes with that direct, measuring look. Home, he said. Your home. Which is where? A pause. The first one she had read as deliberate rather than natural. Blackthorne Hall, he said. The words hit her in a specific place she couldn't name immediately. Then recognition assembled itself piece by piece, with the terrible clarity of a thing becoming real that had previously been abstract. Blackthorne Hall, the seat of the Blackthorne Dominion, home of the most powerful noble family in this region of the empire, home of Duke Caedric Blackthorne, who was described in the accounts she had read as ruthless, calculating, and entirely without mercy when his authority was threatened. She looked at the man across from her. The gray eyes, the jaw that didn't soften, the hands that had signed the marriage documents with the economical signature of someone who had signed thousands of documents that mattered. Cade, she said, short for Caedric. He held her gaze without apology. Yes. You're the Duke. Yes. The carriage continued north through the gray winter afternoon, and Lysandra sat with this information the way a person sat with a wound before the pain fully registered, in the specific suspended moment when the body understood what had happened before the mind caught up. She had married a man believing he was a landowner with a problem. She had married the man who ruled the entire dominion the collectors had used against her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the shock and the fury that were assembling themselves with increasing speed, a smaller and colder thought was taking shape. If he was the Duke, and the conspiracy in her father's ledger ran through his own estate accounts, then one of two things was true. Either he had sent her father's debt collectors himself, and this entire arrangement was a method of controlling the evidence before it could be used against him, or the conspiracy was operating inside his house without his knowledge, which meant he was surrounded by enemies who were using his authority as a weapon against him. And she had just walked directly into the center of it. She kept her hand flat against the ledger beneath her coat. The gates of Blackthorne Hall appeared through the trees ahead, iron and immovable, and the carriage passed through them without slowing because nothing stopped for the Duke who lived inside, including, as Lysandra was beginning to understand, the people who had decided he needed to fall. Blackthorne Hall was a building that did not ask permission. It rose from the landscape the way cliffs rose, not built so much as established, stone fitted to stone across generations with the accumulated confidence of people who had never expected to be told to leave. The main structure was 4 stories of dark granite, the windows deep set and narrow in the old style, designed in a time when the difference between a window and an arrow slit was considered a strategic decision. In the fading winter light, it was not beautiful. It was something else. The word that came to Lysandra's mind, watching it approach through the carriage window, was true. This was what power looked like when it stopped needing to perform itself. The household staff assembled at the entrance with the practiced coordination of a mechanism that had been running this sequence for years. The head housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50, with the posture of someone who had long ago decided that dignity was not optional, acknowledged Lysandra's presence with a look that was professionally neutral and personally assessing, which meant she was good at her job. Caedric, she was going to have to stop thinking of him as the man, as Cade, as the constructed fiction of a simple landowner. Caedric stepped from the carriage and said 4 words to the housekeeper. "See her settled, Marin." Then he walked inside with the contained momentum of a man entering a space that recognized him as its natural center. He did not look back. Lysandra stood at the foot of the steps with the ledger against her ribs and watched him go. The housekeeper appeared at her shoulder. "Your Grace, if you'll follow me." "Your Grace." She followed. The room she was given was not a guest room. She realized this when she saw the connecting door on the far wall, its iron handle polished to a degree that suggested regular use rather than formality. The room itself was large, firelit, furnished with the particular comfortable heaviness of space that had been arranged for long-term occupation rather than temporary accommodation. She stood at the window looking out over the dark grounds and thought about doors. Marin appeared with a light dinner on a tray, set it on the table, and began to withdraw. "How long have you worked here?" Lysandra asked. The housekeeper paused, assessed the question for motives, which was a reasonable thing to do. 22 years, Your Grace." "And in that time, has anyone lived in this room?" A different kind of pause. "No, Your Grace." After Marin left, Lysandra ate without tasting and then sat in the chair nearest the fire and thought about what she knew and what she didn't know and the distance between those two things. She knew the Duke had married her for the ledger. She knew the conspiracy inside that ledger involved people close to his administration. She knew she was inside his house, under his name, with evidence that could destroy either his enemies or him, and she did not yet know which. What she didn't know was whether he had brought her here to use her, protect her, or keep her where he could see her. She didn't know whether the man across the table in the inn had been telling her the truth, or a version of it. She didn't know whether Blackthorne Hall's walls kept enemies out or kept problems in. And she did not know, she realized, sitting in the chair with the fire warm against her face and the ledger pressing into her ribs, that when the connecting door opened, quietly, without announcement, and Caedric Blackthorne appeared in the doorway, in the private, unperformed quiet of his own house, looking at her with the gray eyes that had looked at everything else he considered his. She did not know what he was actually going to say. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then, "I should have told you who I was before the ceremony." "Yes," she said. "You should have. I calculated that if you knew, you wouldn't come." Also correct. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, and for the first time, in the private dark of a house that belonged to him entirely, she saw something in his face that hadn't been visible across the inn table. Not vulnerability exactly. More like the specific tiredness of a man who had spent a long time maintaining a position under sustained assault and was, in this particular room, in this particular moment, no longer performing the maintenance. "There are 47 people in this household," he said. "7 of them report to my uncle's circle. I know which 7. I've known for approximately 4 months. I've said nothing, done nothing, because any move I make against them before the evidence is secured gives my uncle grounds to claim political persecution and rally support from the families he's already bought." He paused. "That's not an explanation, that's context." "It's a partial explanation," she said. "Most explanations are." She looked at him across the room, the fire between them, the cold night outside, the ledger that was simultaneously everything and nothing until she decided what to do with it. "The 7 people," she said. "Can you tell me which ones without trusting someone to deliver the information?" He looked at her with something that shifted in his face, subtle and quick, there and then gone. "I can tell you myself," he said. "Tonight." "Then do that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and crossed the room to the table, pulled out the second chair and sat down across from her the way he had sat across from her in the inn, hands folded, direct and unperformed. "The head groundskeeper," he began, "and the assistant to the estate accounts manager. The 3rd footman on the east corridor, 2 of the 4 kitchen supervisors, the courier who handles external correspondence on Tuesdays and Thursdays." He stopped. "And the 7th, she said. The gray eyes held hers. "The 7th is the man who manages my personal schedule," he said, "which means my uncle has known every significant meeting I've had for the past year and a half." The fire crackled. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the deep-set windows. "Which means," Lysandra said slowly, "that your uncle knew about your trip to Caelin's Cross." Caedric did not move. "He knew you were looking for the ledger," she said. The cold thought that had begun in the carriage was fully formed now, spreading through her with the specific clarity of a thing that should have been obvious and wasn't until it suddenly was. "He knew before you got there." The silence that followed was the kind that came before irreversible things. "Which means," she said, "that this marriage was already known to him," Caedric said quietly. "Yes. Before we arrived. Before we arrived." She stared at him. At the man who had presented himself as the one holding the information, the one with the plan, the one who had calculated every variable. "Then we didn't surprise him," she said. "He let us come home." Caedric said nothing. "He let us come here," she said, and the word here meant the house, the walls, the 47 people, the connected door, the ledger against her ribs, and the specific, terrible understanding that if a man who wanted to destroy the Duke had known about this marriage before it happened, then everything that followed was not a setback for that man. It was exactly what he had wanted. They were inside the trap. They had walked into it together. And somewhere in Blackthorne Hall, in the dark and the cold of a winter night, someone was waiting to spring it. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The fire had burned down to coals, throwing the room in amber and shadow, and Caedric sat across the table from her with the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he had believed was under control. She watched his jaw set, watched the slight tightening around his eyes that was the only external evidence of what was happening inside. Not panic, she understood instinctively, because this man had shed the capacity for panic somewhere early in life and replaced it with something colder and more functional. What she was watching was a fortress running a damage assessment on its own walls. "You knew there was a leak in your schedule," she said. "You didn't know how far it went." "Correct." "So when you came to Caelin's Cross, I used a different route, different timing. I told no one where I was going or why." He paused. But the schedule keeper saw the gap. A man with enough intelligence and enough instruction can infer a great deal from an absence in a calendar. And your uncle is not a man without intelligence. My uncle, Caedric said, with a flatness that contained an entire history, is the most patient man I have ever encountered. He has been waiting for 17 years for a moment to make his move. He does not waste patience like that on unintelligent strategies. Lysandra pressed her palm flat against the table, felt the grain of the wood, solid and real, an anchor. Then the question is what he expected to gain from letting us come here, she said. If he wanted the marriage stopped, he had 4 days to arrange interference. He didn't want it stopped. Why? Caedric looked at her with those gray eyes that gave away only what they chose to. Because a duke who married a village woman in secret, without council approval, without bloodline consultation, without following a single protocol of noble procedure, that duke has handed his enemies a narrative. Impulsive, destabilized by grief, unfit to govern. He said this without inflection, the way a soldier named the caliber of the weapon pointed at him. I gave him the story he needed. I just thought I was giving it to him on my terms. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of two people understanding simultaneously that the ground had shifted under both of them. The ledger, she said. If he knows you have it, he'll move to discredit it before it can be used. Or discredit you. His eyes dropped briefly to where her hand rested against her coat. Or both. He doesn't know what's in it. He knows it exists. Your father was removed specifically because he was getting close to the pattern. Malrek didn't know how much Aldrich had documented before the removal was executed. A pause. He's been trying to find out since. She thought about the debt collectors, the inflated figures, the manufactured urgency of it all. Not simply greed, she understood now, but excavation, a way to go through every corner of her family's life looking for what her father might have hidden. The debt, she said, it wasn't about money. It was never about money. She felt something settle in her chest. Not calm exactly, more like the specific clarity that came when the shape of a problem finally resolved completely and she could see its actual dimensions. Knowing the size of something was not the same as knowing how to survive it, but it was better than fighting something she couldn't see. What do we do tonight? She said. Caedric looked at her steadily. In the dying firelight, his face was all planes and shadow, unreadable in the way that faces became unreadable when the person behind them was running every calculation simultaneously. Tonight, he said, we do nothing, because doing something tonight tells anyone watching that we know they're watching. And tomorrow? Tomorrow you meet the household. You behave like a woman settling into a new home. You are curious but not investigative, warm but not familiar. You do not look at the 7 people I named with any more attention than you give anyone else. And the ledger stays where it is, he said, on your person, until I tell you otherwise. She looked at him across the table, studied the set of his shoulders, the controlled economy of how he occupied space, the way a man moved when he had learned very young that every gesture was read and catalogued by people looking for weakness. You've been managing this alone, she said. For how long? Something crossed his face, brief and undefended, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. Long enough, he said. He stood, buttoned his coat with the same contained efficiency he did everything else, crossed toward the connecting door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Lock the outer door, he said without turning. The bolt is new. I had it replaced 2 weeks ago. Before you came to find me? Yes. She watched him go. The door closed behind him. She sat alone in the cooling room and thought about a man who had replaced the bolt on a room before he knew who would be in it, and what that said about the kind of thinking that had kept him alive inside these walls. Morning came in through the narrow windows with the particular gray reluctance of winter light that had a long way to travel. Lysandra was dressed before the household began to move. Old habit. Her father's house had no servants, and mornings had always been hers to own. She walked to the window and looked out over the grounds, frost-silvered and still, and took a slow breath of the cold air coming through the gap in the frame, and thought about what it meant to be a woman inside a house that belonged to someone else, surrounded by people 7 of whom had been paid to watch. The breakfast room was on the ground floor, east-facing, already occupied when she arrived. The man seated at the far end of the table looked up with the specific expression of someone who had been expecting her, and had arranged themselves accordingly. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had learned to use the memory of handsomeness as a tool. He rose when she entered, which was courtesy deployed as dominance. The gesture that said, "I acknowledge you," in a tone that also said, "I have decided the terms on which you exist here." "You must be the new Duchess," he said. "I'm Malrec, Caedric's uncle." She crossed the room and sat down at the table, not at the opposite end from him, but at the side, which put her at a 90-degree angle, close enough for conversation, far enough to choose her sightlines. "Lord Malrec," she said, "Caedric mentioned you." "Did he?" Not a question, a probe. Briefly, she poured her own tea because the footman near the door had not moved to assist her, which was its own information. "He said you've been an important presence in the administration of the estate." Malrec settled back into his chair with the ease of a man in his own territory. "I've tried to be useful. The Dominion is a significant responsibility, particularly for a man who's been managing it through a period of considerable personal difficulty." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be meaningful. "Grief does things to judgment. I'm sure you understand." She lifted her cup, held his gaze over the rim. "I understand grief. Yes. Of course, your father's illness." His voice carried sympathy the way a weapon carried polish, shining surface, hard underneath. "A terrible situation. You must be relieved to have it resolved." "I'm relieved my father is being cared for." He turned his cup on its saucer, a small circular motion, unhurried. "It's a significant step. Marriage, particularly at this velocity. The council will have questions, naturally." "I imagine they will." Caedric has always been a man of decisive action. It's one of his most admirable qualities. The smile that followed was the kind that had practiced itself into looking genuine, and one of his most challenging ones. She set down her cup. "Lord Malrec," she said, and kept her voice at conversational temperature, nothing warmer and nothing colder. "I grew up in a household where the accounts were kept meticulously because the alternative was ruin. I learned early that most conversations are really about something other than what they're nominally about." She met his eyes. "So let's save us both the time of going through the form of this particular conversation and agree that you've assessed me, I've assessed you, and we can proceed from there." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when one person said something the other had not expected, and the other was deciding whether to be impressed or threatened. Malrec looked at her for a long moment. Then the smile became something more real, which was somehow less comfortable than its manufactured version. "Caedric," he said, "has made an interesting choice." "He tends to." She stood, took her cup, and walked to the window because she wanted her back to him briefly, and she wanted him to watch her choose to give it, which was its own message. Outside, 2 groundskeepers were moving along the frost-edged path near the east garden. She looked at them with the pleasant, unseeing gaze of a woman admiring winter scenery and noted, without expression, that one of them moved with the specific attentiveness of someone listening to a room through a window. She turned back. Malrec was watching her with those experienced eyes. "It's a beautiful property," she said. "It has been in the family a long time," he agreed. "We are all very protective of it." The word we landed where he intended it to. She heard it, registered it, and gave him nothing back. "I should see to the housekeeper," she said. "I'd like to understand how the household runs." "Of course." He rose again, that same courtesy as dominance, and she noticed now that his right hand rested near the edge of the table after he stood. Not gripping, just present, in the way a man kept a hand near something he considered his own. "Welcome to Blackthorne Hall, Your Grace." She left the room. In the corridor, she walked at an unhurried pace and let the knowledge settle through her like cold water. The knowledge that she had just sat across from the man who had manufactured her father's destruction and who had done it with such structural precision that it looked legal from every angle that mattered, and that he had looked at her across a breakfast table and seen either a tool or an obstacle and was still deciding which. She put her hand against the ledger beneath her coat. Survive first, she thought. Everything else after. Duke Caedric found her in the library 2 hours later. He moved through the doorway with the controlled momentum she was already starting to recognize as specific to him. Not hurried, never hurried, but purposeful in a way that suggested stillness was chosen rather than natural. He checked the corridor before closing the door, which she filed away without comment. "You spoke to him," he said. "He was at breakfast." "What did he say?" "What he meant was that I'm an outsider without legitimacy. You've made an unstable decision, and he's watching to determine whether I'm an asset or a liability." She paused. What he actually said was considerably more pleasant. Caedric stood near the window with his hands at his sides, and something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the end table, that complete attention, but it had changed slightly, or she was seeing it differently now that she understood what he was. Not a landowner with a problem, a man who had lived inside a war for 17 years and had stopped expecting it to end cleanly. "The groundskeeper on the East Path," she said, "the one I saw this morning. He was listening to the breakfast room." Caedric's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, nearly invisible, the adjustment of a man recalibrating a variable. "You identified him in the first hour," he said. "My father used to say that people who are paid to watch carry it in their shoulders. They hold still differently from people who are just still." A pause. "I need to show you something," he said. He crossed to the far bookshelf, and she watched him move a specific volume, not dramatically, just a practiced reach. And behind the shelf, a section of the back panel opened on a hinge so well maintained it made no sound. Behind it was a recess, perhaps 2 feet deep. Inside were documents, rolled and stacked with the density of years. "What is this?" she said. "My own record," he said. "Parallel to the official accounts. I've been building it for 4 years. He looked at her. "I wasn't only looking for your father's ledger, Lysandra. I was looking for the piece that closes the chain. Everything I have documents the pattern. What I don't have is the origin point, where the mechanism was first built, by whom, and what authorization they used to construct it." She understood before he finished. "My father's records go back further," she said. "Further than anything else I've found. Your father was in those accounts before anyone knew there was a reason to hide them. He documented the scheme before the scheme knew it was being documented." She reached inside her coat, pulled out the ledger. She held it between them for a moment. This object that had cost her family 2 years of ruin, that had cost her father his health, that she had slept with against her body like a second heartbeat for 6 months. Then she set it on the table between them. Caedric looked at it the way people looked at things that had mattered for a long time from a distance. He didn't reach for it immediately. "You're giving it to me," he said. "I'm sharing it with you," she said. "There's a difference. I want to be part of what's built with it. Not because I need revenge." She stopped, reconsidered. "Not only because I need revenge, but because I've read every page of that ledger 30 times, and I know what it says better than anyone alive." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. He picked up the ledger and opened it to the first page with the careful hands of someone handling something irreplaceable, and the two of them sat down on opposite sides of the library table. And for the next 3 hours they worked through it together, her reading, him cross-referencing against his own documents, both of them building something that neither had been able to build alone. She watched him work, watched the way his mind operated, not with the bureaucratic efficiency of a man following procedure, but with the focused intensity of someone who had been personally wronged and was doing the work of not letting that show while it drove everything. There was a question she had been holding back since the previous night. She asked it now while his attention was on the documents and his guard was fractionally lower. "Your uncle has been positioning against you for 17 years, she said. "What happened 17 years ago?" His pen stopped moving. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his face had closed in a way that was different from his professional reserve, something older and more personal behind it. "My father died," he said, "and Malrek expected to inherit the title. My father had 2 sons. I was the elder by 4 years, but I was 17 and there were people who believed 17 was young enough to be managed." A pause. "I was not manageable." She looked at him across the documents. At the man who had been a 17-year-old inheriting a title with an uncle who believed the throne should be his, and who had spent every year since then fighting a war of attrition inside his own walls. He never gave up, she said. He became more patient, Caedric said. That's not the same as giving up. He looked back down at the ledger. She looked at the connecting door between their rooms, the bolt he had replaced before he knew who would be behind it, and thought about what it cost a person to spend 17 years sleeping 12 feet from the person who wanted them gone, performing competence, performing stability, performing the impenetrable authority that kept every enemy at arm's length. And she thought about what it meant that he had ridden into Kaelin's cross and made the decision to bring her here, into the center of it. Not because he needed her there. He could have arranged for the ledger to be handed over discreetly, used through channels, handled at a safe distance. He had married her. He had brought her inside. That was a choice, made by a man who calculated everything. And she didn't yet know what calculation it represented. The afternoon light shifted. Caedric turned a page and went still. She looked at what he was looking at, a column of figures near the back of the ledger, a section she had always understood was significant, but whose full significance she had not had the reference material to decode. "What is it?" she said. He read for another 30 seconds without answering. Then he set the ledger down. "The names at the end," he said. "The 3 names your father recorded. Malrec, Ashcroft, and the estate administrator." "Not an estate administrator," he said, and his voice had gone flat in the way it went flat when he was controlling something large. "This is the signature of the Dominion's chief magistrate, the man responsible for overseeing the legal legitimacy of every land transfer, every debt proceeding, every property seizure in this Dominion for the past 12 years. She stared at him. "If the chief magistrate is part of this," she said, "then every legal proceeding they've used to execute the scheme has his stamp on it, and every appeal that's been filed against them, every family that's tried to fight back through legal channels, has gone directly to the man who built the mechanism they were trying to fight." The room felt very quiet. "That's not a conspiracy inside your estate," she said slowly. "No," he said, "it isn't. That's a corrupted Dominion." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw in his face something that was not calculation or control or the managed stillness of a man performing invulnerability. She saw the specific exhaustion of someone who has just confirmed the worst version of a thing they had suspected, but had hoped was smaller. "If I move against them openly," he said, "the magistrate declares the evidence legally tainted. My uncle calls a council motion. Ashcroft's family mobilizes their allies." He paused. "And if I do nothing, the next family is already on the list," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to the ledger, still open on the table between them. And then they moved to her face with that direct, undeflected attention. "There is one action I can take," he said, "that would move faster than their ability to respond. But it requires me to publicly compromise my position in a way I have spent 17 years refusing to do." "What action?" "I call a full Dominion tribunal," he said. "Mandatory attendance. Every major landholder, every magistrate, every council member. On my authority as Duke, binding under Dominion law. They cannot refuse without grounds, and they cannot prepare fast enough to coordinate a counter-strategy if I announce it and execute it inside 48 hours. You'd be calling a tribunal to try members of your own family and the chief magistrate on evidence provided by your wife, who has been married to you for 4 days. Yes, she held his gaze. They will destroy you for it. They will try. Even if you win the tribunal. I know. His voice was very even. My reputation in the nobility will be split permanently between those who see it as justice and those who see it as a duke willing to eat his own bloodline for political survival. He paused. But if I don't call it, they move first. They've been waiting for a stable moment, and we just handed them one. She looked at the man across the table from her. The man who had brought her into this, knowingly or otherwise. The man who had 17 years of war in his posture and had just laid out the terms of the next battle with the precision of someone who had been preparing for it for a long time. "What do you need from me?" she said. "To stand in that tribunal beside me and present your father's evidence personally," he said. Not as a document submitted through a clerk, as a witness. His eyes held hers without flinching. My uncle will attack your credibility, your background, your motives, your relationship to me. It will be designed to be humiliating. I know what I'm willing to endure, she said. I know you do, he said, and something in his voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but different. The way a very controlled person sounded when they said something they actually meant. That's not why I'm warning you. She looked at him. I'm warning you, he said, because once you stand in that room, you become the target, not supporting evidence, not a wife in the background. The target. And I need you to understand that before you say yes, because once the tribunal is called, there's no taking it back. No, he said. There isn't. The fire in the library grate had burned steadily through the afternoon, indifferent to the shape of the conversation happening in front of it. Outside the narrow windows, the grounds of Blackthorne Hall were darkening toward evening, and somewhere in this house 7 people were watching and reporting, and somewhere in a private room Malrec Blackthorne was conducting his own calculations with the patience of a man who had been waiting 17 years and had just watched the door open. Lysandra put her hand flat on the table, felt the solid grain of wood, the same anchor as the night before. Then she looked at Caedric Blackthorne and said the word that could not be unsaid. Yes. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached across the table and closed the ledger, carefully, with both hands. I'll send the summons tonight, he said. 48 hours. She nodded. He stood, walked to the door. She spoke before he reached it. Caedric. He stopped, turned. The schedule keeper, she said. The 7th person. The one who told your uncle about the gap in your calendar. She paused. He'll report the tribunal summons the moment it goes out. A pause. By which point, he said, it will already be sealed and delivered. That's not my question. She looked at him steadily. My question is whether he reports anything else, whether he was in a position to hear this conversation. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Caedric's expression did not change, but his eyes moved briefly and involuntarily to the door through which he had entered, to the corridor beyond it, and she understood, in the specific cold clarity of a person who has just watched a very controlled man have a reaction he didn't intend to have, that the answer to her question was something he had not previously considered, and that somewhere very close to this room there was a person who had just heard everything. Caedric moved first, not toward the door, toward the fireplace where a pull cord hung against the stone. A summons cord, she realized, one of several positioned throughout the house for calling specific staff. He pulled it twice. Short, deliberate. A prearranged signal for someone. Then he turned back to her, and his voice dropped to a register that barely qualified as sound. How certain are you? Certain enough that I'm telling you, she said. He crossed to the door, opened it 4 inches, and stood there for 3 seconds, listening to the corridor with the focused stillness of someone who had learned to read silence as a language. Then he closed it. The schedule keeper's name is Renwick, he said. His room is on the 2nd floor, north corridor, 12 steps from the servant's stair. He said this without any particular emotion, the way a person named a coordinate rather than a human being. If he heard us through the study wall and moves to report it tonight, he uses the servant's stair to reach the exterior passage near the kitchen garden. It's the route he's used before. You've watched him. I've watched all 7 of them, without acting. His jaw tightened briefly. 4 months of watching and not acting. Because acting without the evidence closed the chain. Yes. She stood up from the table. And now we've given him something worth reporting before the chain is closed. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed, distant and domestic, the ordinary sound of a household settling into evening, and yet neither of them moved because they were both listening beneath the ordinary sound for something that wasn't ordinary at all. The tribunal summons, she said. If Renwick reports it before it goes out, Malrec moves to convene an emergency council session on grounds of the Duke's conduct, uses the marriage, uses the procedural violations, uses whatever else he's been building. Caedric's voice was flat and precise. The council session supersedes my tribunal authority while it's in session. That gives him the room. How long to convene an emergency council? 12 hours if he has the signatures already prepared. A pause. Which he does. She looked at him. You know he has them prepared. I've known for 2 months. And you've been waiting. I've been waiting for the evidence to be complete. He said it without defensiveness, but something underneath it was taut as wire. Every move I make without a closed chain hands him a narrative. Impulsive. Paranoid. A duke dismantling his own administration because grief made him unstable. The word grief came out with a specific compression around it, like a wound that had been pressed on enough times that the pressing had become automatic. She filed that away. Then we move tonight, she said, before Renwick does. The summons requires a court seal. The keeper of the court seal is one of the 7. The silence between them lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Caedric said very quietly, yes. She understood what that meant, not just the logistical problem of it, the whole shape of it. 4 months of watching, of calculating, of building a case with the patience of a man who understood that patience was the only weapon that didn't announce itself, and beneath it all this, that the mechanism designed to deliver justice was staffed, at its key points, by people who had been paid to ensure it never arrived. A knock at the library door, 3 short, 1 long. Caedric opened it. The man who entered was perhaps 45, compact and weathered, wearing the plain coat of a senior groundskeeper. He was not one of the 7. His eyes moved to Lysandra once, assessed her with the quick efficiency of someone deciding whether a person needed to be accounted for, and then moved back to Caedric. My lord, he said. The title was quiet and genuine, which distinguished it from every other use of it she'd heard in this house. Harson, Caedric said. The North Corridor, now. Harson left without another word. Caedric turned to her. Stay here. Lock the door. Caedric. Lysandra. Her name in his mouth was not a command. It was something more direct than that, and less comfortable. There are things I can do in the next 20 minutes that I cannot do with a witness, and I need you to understand that and accept it. She held his gaze. In it, she read the specific request of a man who had operated alone for a long time and was asking her, in the only way he knew how, to trust a space he wasn't ready to open. She sat back down. He left. She locked the door. Fun. She heard nothing for 18 minutes, which was its own kind of information. Blackthorne Hall at night was not silent. It breathed the way old stone structures breathed, settling and adjusting, the fire in the grate, the distant shift of the wind against the north-facing walls. She sat in the library chair and listened beneath those sounds for anything that didn't belong, and heard nothing that didn't belong, and was not reassured by this. The ledger was on the table where Caedric had left it. She pulled it toward her and opened it again, not to read but to think, because she thought better when her hands had something to do. Her father had kept this record for 3 years without anyone knowing it existed. He had done it in the margins of legitimate work, folded into the daily performance of a man doing his assigned job impeccably while documenting the rot underneath it. She had always understood this as caution, as fear, maybe, as the instinct of a small man in the presence of powerful ones. She understood it differently now. He had known that acting directly was suicide. He had known that the mechanism would close against him the moment he tried to use official channels. So he had done the one thing that couldn't be preempted. He had built the evidence in silence, in time, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the only advantage the powerless had over the powerful was that no one bothered to watch them carefully enough. They had been wrong about that in the end. Someone had watched, but the ledger had survived. She pressed her palm flat on its open page. The door opened. Caedric came back alone. He was not visibly different from when he'd left. Same controlled bearing, same contained economy of movement. But something in the room shifted when he entered it, a change in atmospheric pressure, and she understood that whatever had happened in the North Corridor in the past 18 minutes had altered the situation in a way she was not yet equipped to read. He sat down, said nothing for a moment. Renwick is gone, he said. She looked at him. Not apprehended, he said. Gone. The North Corridor window was open. He'd already moved. A pause. Which means he heard us earlier than I estimated. which means he's been in position for longer than I knew. She sat with this. He's reporting to Malrek now. He's been reporting to Malrek for the past 2 hours, most likely. Caedric's voice was even in the way that surfaces were even when something very large was pressing against them from the other side. The tribunal summons, the ledger, the names inside it, the connection between your father's records and mine. The full shape of it assembled itself in her chest, like something cold and architectural. He heard us say the chief magistrate's name, she said. Yes. Which means the chief magistrate knows his name is in the ledger. By now, yes. She looked at the man across the table from her, at the face that had been calculating this war for 17 years and had just lost the advantage it had spent 6 months positioning to gain. She watched him absorb it, not with collapse, not with the visible disintegration of someone who had bet everything on a single position. With the specific contained quality of a man recalculating while the ground moved, because the ground moving was something he had always known was possible, and had lived with the knowledge of it long enough that it no longer broke him. It just changed the parameters. She found that she could not determine, in this moment, whether that quality was strength or something that had started as strength and calcified into something else entirely. What happens now, she said. Malrek calls the emergency session, he said. Before morning, I would estimate. He has the signatures. He has the procedural grounds. He has Renwick's testimony about the tribunal plan, which he'll use to frame me as attempting to circumvent council authority. A pause. And he has the magistrate's cooperation, which means any evidence we present through official channels will be evaluated by a man whose name is in the ledger we're presenting. The session supersedes your tribunal authority. While it's active, yes. Can you challenge the session's legitimacy? On what grounds? I've given him every ground he needs, the marriage, the procedural violations, the fact that I've been building a parallel evidence record for 4 years without disclosing it to the council. He said this without flinching from any of it, which was its own form of discipline. He doesn't need to prove I'm corrupt. He needs to prove I'm unstable. And I've handed him the evidence for that argument in the past 4 days. She looked at the ledger. Then we can't wait for a formal proceeding, she said. No. And we can't move through official channels without the magistrate intercepting. No. Which means, she said slowly, the only thing that changes this is making it public before he can make it contained. Caedric looked at her. The nobles who are coming to Blackthorne Hall for the council session, she said. They travel. They arrive with staff. They talk to each other before they sit down in any official room. She was thinking as she spoke, feeling the shape of it form the way her father had taught her, not forcing a conclusion, following the logic of the numbers until they pointed somewhere. If the evidence exists in the room before the session opens, not submitted through official channels, not certified by the magistrate, but known, physically in the hands of the people who are supposed to evaluate it, Malrek will call it procedurally invalid. He'll call it that regardless. The question is whether the people hearing it believe him. She met his eyes. There are nobles coming to this session who have tenant families, who have estates neighboring ones that were taken, who have heard rumors about irregularities for years and have had no framework to understand them. She paused. If they see the ledger before the session, then the session doesn't control the narrative, he said. It responds to it. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The risk, he said, is that if Malrek identifies what we're doing before enough people have seen it, he moves to have the ledger seized. Evidence in public hands can be retrieved. People can be pressured. His eyes held hers. Including you. She heard the specific weight in that last word. Not warning. Something closer to acknowledgement. The admission, from a man who acknowledged very little, that the thing he was describing was not an abstract risk. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he stood, crossed to the recess behind the bookshelf, and began pulling documents, his own 4 years of parallel records, and stacking them with the efficient speed of someone executing a decision already made. I have 3 allies in the incoming council delegation, he said. Men who have owed me debts for years and who dislike my uncle for reasons that predate this dispute. I can reach them before they arrive through their own private couriers, outside the household staff. He paused. If they receive the evidence package tonight, how far is the nearest courier station outside the estate grounds? He looked at her. The grounds have 7 perimeter points, he said carefully. 6 of them are staffed by household employees. And the seventh is Harson's post, the groundskeeper. Who is not one of the 7, she said. No, he said. He is not. She stood up. Then give me the package. He went still, not the calculated stillness she had come to recognize, something more fundamental. Lysandra, if you go through the grounds tonight, Malrek has a Duke moving in secret, and that becomes part of his narrative. If Harson goes, they'll watch him. She held Caedric's gaze. No one is watching me yet. I've been here less than 48 hours. I'm a village woman who married above her station and hasn't done anything interesting since she arrived. She paused. Let me be boring for one more night. The silence lasted long enough that she counted her own heartbeats inside it. It's 3 miles to the nearest courier point, he said. I know how to walk 3 miles. In the dark. In Caedric. She said his name the way he had said hers earlier. Not a command, something more direct. This is what I came here to do. Not as evidence storage, not as a procedural shield. She looked at him without flinching from the gray eyes or the calculation happening behind them. Let me do it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the documents and began assembling the courier package. She watched his hands move, precise, unhurried, certain, and thought about a man who had spent 17 years being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, controlling every variable, trusting no one with anything that mattered, and was now wrapping a package of evidence that could end his rule or save it and handing it to a woman he had known for 4 days. She thought about what that cost him. She thought he probably didn't have words for what it cost him. The package was inside her coat, beside the ledger, when she left through the kitchen passage at the hour when the household was deepest in sleep. The grounds were cold and absolutely dark, the sky sealed with cloud, and she moved along the east garden wall with her hand trailing the stone for orientation, her breath controlled, her feet finding the frozen ground with the quiet care of someone who had grown up walking unpaved lanes in the dark and knew how sound traveled in cold air. She was 20 yards from the perimeter gate when the lantern appeared. It was not Harson's lantern. Harson's post was north. This light came from the south, moving with purpose, and behind it were 2 figures, and behind them a third. She stopped, pressed herself against the garden wall. The lantern swung and steadied, and in its radius she saw the face of the man holding it. Lord Malrek Blackthorne, dressed for travel, with the particular alert calm of a man who had expected this and arrived early. Beside him, a figure she recognized from the household, the 3rd footman from the east corridor, one of the 7. And beside the footman, in the specific posture of someone who had been collected rather than recruited, was Harson. Not standing with them, standing between them with the specific stillness of a man who has been removed from a post he was occupying and is being held in place by people who are not his allies. Malrek raised his lantern, found her. She did not move, did not run. Running was a confession, and she understood with the cold, clear certainty of someone who had spent 6 months practicing how to think clearly under pressure that the next 30 seconds would determine everything, and that every instinct toward panic was a gift she was about to give to the wrong person. Malrek looked at her across the dark grounds with the expression of a man who had been patient for 17 years and had finally arrived at the moment he'd been building toward. "Your Grace," he said. The title was precise and pleasant and absolutely devastating. It's a cold night to be walking. She held his gaze across the dark. In her coat were the letters, the documents, the 4 years of Caedric's evidence, and her father's ledger. Everything that could end this. Everything that hadn't yet reached the people who needed to see it. She was 3 miles from the courier point. She was 20 yards from a man who knew exactly what she was carrying. And behind her, in the house, was a duke who had sent her out here trusting her to be boring for one more night. The lantern light threw long shadows across the frost. Malrek took 1 step forward, and Lysandra Vale, daughter of a disgraced clerk, wife of 4 days, stood in the frozen dark with everything at stake and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the version of herself who had negotiated carefully, moved cautiously, and waited for the right procedural moment was not the version of herself that was going to survive the next 60 seconds. She needed to become something else. Right now, she did not run. She walked toward him, not fast, not slow, with the specific, deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision and was now inhabiting it completely, because hesitation was a smell, and Malrec Blackthorne was the kind of man who had spent 60 years learning to detect it. He watched her come with something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. The expression of a chess player watching an opponent make an unexpected move and recalculating whether it was brilliance or desperation. "Lord Malrec," she said, stopping 6 feet from him, close enough for conversation, far enough to read his body. "I couldn't sleep. The north wing is cold." "Is it?" His eyes moved briefly to the shape of her coat, what she carried beneath it. "I've always found Blackthorne Hall rather comfortable." "Perhaps it's a matter of familiarity." "Perhaps." He let the pause breathe. "Where were you walking to, Your Grace?" "The kitchen garden. Marin mentioned there are herbs kept under glass frames on the south wall. My father's physician recommended, at this hour. Sleeplessness makes the hours less distinct." Malrec looked at her with the patient, penetrating attention of a man who had survived 60 years of political warfare by learning when a person was lying and enjoying the specific process of letting them continue. The footman beside him had moved 2 steps to the right without being told, a flanking position made to look accidental. She noted it without looking at it. Harson stood between them with his hands at his sides and his face absolutely controlled, which told her he had been told to stand there and told what would happen if he didn't. "I wonder," Malrec said pleasantly, "if we might walk together, back toward the house. It really is an unpleasant temperature for outdoor contemplation." She was 280 yards from the perimeter gate. She was also standing in front of a man who had arrived at this precise location at this precise time, which meant he knew where she was going and why, which meant Renwick had been thorough. The footman to her right was edging closer. She made the calculation in the time it took to breathe in. "Of course," she said, and turned toward the house. She was 12 steps into the walk when she heard it. A sound from the direction of the north perimeter, specific and deliberate. The sound of a gate not opening quietly, but opening fast. And then boots on frozen ground moving with the organized urgency of people who had been waiting for a signal. Malrec heard it too. His head turned. In that single second of divided attention, she stepped left, hard, past the footman's reach, and ran. Not toward the perimeter gate, toward the house, because she had just understood something in the space between one breath and the next. Something that had been assembling itself in the back of her mind since Malrec had appeared with a lantern at this hour, at this location, with Harson held between his people. Malrec had not come outside to stop her from leaving. He had come outside because he had already moved inside. The kitchen passage door was unlocked, which was wrong. She had latched it behind her. She pushed through it anyway because the alternative was the open grounds with the footman 30 yards back and closing, and inside was at least geometry she understood. The kitchen was dark and empty, and she moved through it fast, through the servants' corridor, toward the main hall staircase, and she was listening for Caedric, the way you listened for something you needed to be real, with the specific taut attention of someone who understood that the version of events where he was fine was not guaranteed. She heard voices from the east corridor, not domestic voices, the voices of men in the middle of something. She took the servants' stair instead of the main one, came out on the second floor from the north end, moved along the wall with her hand on the stone and her breathing controlled, and her heart doing something loud and irregular that she was choosing to ignore. The library door was open. She had left it locked. She stopped outside it, listened for 3 seconds, then looked around the frame. 2 men she didn't recognize stood inside the library. Estate officials, by their coats, the kind of men who arrived with documentation and the specific authority of paperwork rather than violence. They were at the table where the ledger had been. The table was empty. One of them was looking at the recess behind the bookshelf, which was open, which meant they had been specifically directed to it. Her father's ledger was still inside her coat. Caedric's 4 years of documents were not on the table. She moved back from the doorway and kept moving in thought, fast and cold, about what the open recess meant. Either Caedric had cleared it before they arrived, or they had arrived first and found nothing there. Either way, they were looking, which meant they hadn't found what they came for, which meant there was still something to protect. She found him in the east sitting room, not alone. Caedric stood near the fireplace with 3 men she half recognized from the household, not servants, council-adjacent figures who had arrived with the evening's official correspondence and apparently had not left. One of them was speaking. Caedric was not. His hands were at his sides in that controlled stillness, and his face was the completely closed version she had not seen since the first morning at the breakfast table. He saw her in the doorway. Something moved in his eyes, fast and suppressed, and not entirely professional. Then he looked back at the man speaking. "Council convenes at first light," the man was saying. "The summons has already gone to the delegations. Lord Malrec has invoked emergency protocol under Section 14 of the Dominion Charter, which requires—" "I know what Section 14 requires," Caedric said. His voice was level. It was the levelness of something under extreme compression. "I wrote the commentary on it when I was 22. Then you'll understand that the Duke's authority to convene an independent tribunal is suspended during—" "I understand what you've been sent here to tell me," Caedric said. "I'm asking you who sent you." A pause. "The council secretary acting on Lord Malrec's instruction." The man's chin went up slightly. "Acting on the emergency petition, which has been signed by 9 council members," Caedric said. "I know. I've known about the signatures for 2 months." He let that land, watched it land. "Tell me something. When you walked through the door of this house tonight with your Section 14 summons, did you consider that a man who has known about the signatures for 2 months might have considered what his response would be?" The room was very quiet. Lysandra stepped fully inside. The 3 men glanced at her. Caedric did not. "The session convenes at dawn," the council official said, recovering his footing. "Your Grace is expected to attend and is advised to present any counter-petition through the standard procedural." "Get out of my house," Caedric said. The flatness of it was total. Not loud, not heated. The specific flatness of a man who had spent 17 years choosing not to say a thing and had just chosen differently. The official blinked. "My lord, I must advise you that failure to cooperate with the emergency— You've delivered your message. You've done your job." Caedric looked at him with the gray eyes at their most absolute. "Now get out of my house before I decide that hosting you overnight constitutes an endorsement of the process you represent." They left. When the door closed, Caedric turned to her. His eyes went to her coat first. She understood what the question was. "Still here?" she said. Something in him shifted. Not visibly, just a change in the quality of his stillness, the specific release of a calculation that had been running at high tension in the background. "Malrec was in the grounds," she said. "He had Harson. He knows I was going for the courier point." She paused. "He also sent people to the library. The recess was open." "I cleared it an hour ago," he said. "When Renwick's window was found open, I expected they'd move to the library first." "Where are the documents?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the fireplace, crouched, and from behind the iron fireback, a space not designed for storage but usable as one by someone who had spent enough time inside this house to know every space that wasn't what it appeared to be, he pulled a sealed case, canvas and leather, the kind used for field correspondence. He'd had it ready, packed and sealed and hidden before she'd left through the kitchen passage. She stared at it. "You knew they'd move tonight," she said. "I knew when Renwick's window was open that we had hours, not days." He stood. "I also knew that if Malrec's people found the library empty, they'd report that the evidence had already been moved, which would force him to reveal how much he actually knew about its contents, rather than letting him believe he'd found it. Information about what he knows is worth more to me right now than a clean library." He set the case on the table and looked at her directly. "Malrec has the council session. He has the magistrate. He has the procedural authority to frame everything I do as political instability." A pause. "What he does not have is a dominion that unanimously agrees with him." She looked at the sealed case. "The three allies in the incoming delegation," she said. "Lord Fenwick Eris, Lord Colin Marsh, Lady Idrith Hale." He named them with the precision of someone naming positions on a map. Eris has 2 tenant villages that border properties seized under the scheme. Marsh lost a cousin to a manufactured debt proceeding 4 years ago and has never been able to prove why. Hale has been building her own quiet record of irregularities for 3 years without knowing anyone else was doing the same. A pause. "They are not coming to this session as Malrek's allies. They are coming because Section 14 requires their attendance, which means they're already in transit, which means they arrive before dawn, before the session opens, before Malrek controls the room." He looked at her. "If they receive the evidence package before they walk through that door, they don't walk in blind. They walk in knowing," he said, "and knowing changes what they're willing to do with what they hear." She understood the architecture of it now. Not a frontal assault on Malrek's procedural position, which was unassailable, but a different kind of pressure. The session would happen. The council would convene. Malrek would run his procedure. But the people sitting in the room would have already read the documents, already understood the pattern, already held in their hands the evidence that the chief magistrate had spent 12 years ensuring they'd never see. You couldn't control the verdict of people who had already reached one. "The courier point is still 3 miles away," she said. "We don't need the courier point." He looked at her steadily. "We need someone to ride. Tonight, before the estate roads are watched." He paused. "Harson is compromised. My outriders are estate staff. The 3 council officials who just left will report my reaction within the hour, which means Malrek knows I'm not cooperating, which means he moves to close the roads. How long before he closes them? An hour? Maybe less." She looked at the case on the table. Then she looked at Caedric Blackthorne and said, "Who else do you have?" The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a very self-contained man ran the honest inventory of his position and did not like the number he arrived at. "In this house tonight," he said, "that I trust completely." He held her gaze. "You." She heard that word the way it was intended, not as a declaration, not as a performance, but as a fact delivered by a man who had spent 17 years not trusting and had arrived at this specific moment with exactly one name on the list. It cost him something to say it. She could see that it cost him something. And the fact that he said it anyway was its own kind of information about the distance he had traveled in 4 days. "Give me the case," she said. "Lysandra. Caedric." She reached out and put her hand on the case. His hand was already on it. For a second they were both holding it, and the contact was not accidental, and neither of them addressed it. "Give me the case. I'll go south, not east. The south access crosses the Bessel land. I know that route. I walked it twice a week for 2 years. She met his eyes. "Malrek doesn't know I know it. He's watching the roads. He's not watching a field path in the dark because no one from this house would know to use one. You grew up 12 miles from here. 11. And I paid attention." He looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight, his face was doing the thing it occasionally did, the thing where the control slipped fractionally, and what was behind it was visible for the space of a breath. Not weakness. Something more human than weakness. The specific expression of a man who had been alone inside a problem for a very long time and was still not entirely certain he believed in the alternative. He let go of the case. She picked it up. "If you're stopped," he said, "the case cannot be found on you. The documents inside are originals. Copies don't exist." "I know." "If Malrek's people intercept you, they won't. If they do," he said, and his voice was very level, "you give them nothing. You are a woman who couldn't sleep. You were walking. You know nothing about any documents." He paused. "You tell them I'm a man you married 4 days ago and barely know." She looked at him. "I can't say that," she said. "Lysandra." "I can't say that," she said again, quietly, "because it's not true. And because if I say it, it serves their narrative." She adjusted the case under her arm. "What's true is that I'm a Duchess of Blackthorne on the grounds of Blackthorne Hall at night. That's my right. That's my name. If they stop me, I'll use both." Something moved through his face. too fast to fully name. "The South Path," he said. "Where does it come out?" "Near the Arras Estate's secondary gate. Lord Arras will be traveling from the north, but his advance rider will have come ahead." She paused. "If I reach the advance rider before the road is closed, the package reaches Arras before dawn." He nodded. "Once." She turned toward the door. "Lysandra." She stopped, did not turn immediately. Listened to the quality of the silence behind her voice, which was the specific silence of a man who had something to say and was fighting the habit of 17 years that told him not to say it. She turned. He was looking at her across the room with his hands at his sides and his face open in the way it was very rarely open. Not vulnerable exactly, but present. Actually present. The way a person looked when they stopped performing composure and just stood in the space. "Come back," he said. 2 words. No ornamentation. The specific stripped-down honesty of a man who had decided that the gap between what he felt and what he said was a luxury he could no longer afford. She held his gaze for 1 second. "I intend to," she said. She left through the south passage. Haute. The field path was exactly where she remembered it. She moved fast in the dark, the case against her body, the ledger against her ribs, her breath controlled and her feet finding the frozen ground with the quiet certainty of someone who had walked this land in worse conditions for worse reasons. The cold was absolute. The cloud cover was complete. She navigated by memory and by the feel of the terrain shifting under her feet. Softer here where the drainage ran, firmer there where the chalk base came close to the surface. She was 40 minutes out when she heard the horse. Not behind her. Ahead and to the left. A single mount moving slow. The careful pace of a rider covering unfamiliar ground in the dark, which meant someone who hadn't been on this path before. She stopped. Listened. The horse was moving parallel to her, maybe 80 yards north, moving toward the Blackthorne Estate Road, not away from it. Not Malrek's people. Someone arriving. She cut north across the frost-stiff grass and came out onto the narrow verge of the estate's south approach road just as the rider came level with her. The horse shied. The rider controlled it with practiced ease and looked down at her in the darkness with the alert wariness of a man who had just had a woman materialize from a field in the middle of the night. "Lord Arras's advance rider," she said. Not a question. A pause. "Who's asking?" "Lysandra Blackthorne," she said, and used the name for the first time without the qualification of uncertainty. "Duchess of Blackthorne, I have a package for your lord that needs to be in his hands before he reaches the estate, before the session opens." She held up the case. 4 years of evidence, and a dead man's ledger that closes a 12-year chain of corruption inside this dominion. The rider looked at the case, looked at her, at the frost on her coat, the steadiness of her hands, the specific look of someone who had walked 3 miles in the dark and was not done yet. "My lord needs to verify. Your lord can verify everything in that case when he reads it," she said. "What he cannot do is unread it after the session opens, and Malrek Blackthorne has had 4 hours to control what gets said in that room." She met the rider's eyes. "You get to decide whether Lord Arras walks in blind or walks in knowing. That's what I'm offering you. Make it fast." The rider looked at the case for another 3 seconds. Then he reached down and took it. She watched him go. Listened to the hoofbeats fade into the dark. Then stood alone on the verge of the road in the absolute cold and breathed. The ledger was still inside her coat. The case was gone. It was done. Or it was the beginning of done, which was the most anyone could guarantee about anything. She turned back toward the field path. She was 20 steps into the return when the light appeared from the estate road behind her. Not 1 lantern, 3, moving fast, and behind them the sound of multiple horses, and a voice she recognized calling instructions to the riders around him with the calm authority of a man who had been planning this particular net for a very long time. Malrek had closed the roads, 20 minutes faster than Caedric had estimated. She stood in the dark between the vanished rider and the approaching lights, and understood that the advance rider was gone, and the case was gone, and what remained was her, alone, on foot, 12 seconds from being found by the man who had destroyed her family once and was now positioned to determine what happened to everything she'd just risked. She pressed her hand flat against the ledger. Her father's 3 years of silence, her 6 months of carrying it, Caedric's 17 years of war, all of it, here, under her hand, in the dark. The lanterns found her. Malrek pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away and looked down at her with the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he had been building toward for months. "Your Grace," he said, "I hope you haven't been doing anything inadvisable." His eyes moved to her coat. He knew about the case. He knew about the ledger. And from the shape of his expression, that particular quality of a man who had covered every exit and was simply waiting for acknowledgement of the fact, he believed he had arrived in time. He did not know about the advance rider. He did not know the case was already gone. She stood in the lantern light and looked up at the man who had unmade her family with paperwork and patience and the confidence of someone who had never once been held accountable for any of it, and she understood that what she did in the next 30 seconds would either confirm his confidence or break it. The ledger was the last piece. Her father's 3 years of documentation, the origin point that closed the chain and made everything else irrefutable. If Malrek took it tonight, with the council session in 6 hours and the magistrate's cooperation secured, he buried it. He buried her father's testimony. He buried the families whose names were in it. He buried the evidence that would have made the difference between Caedric surviving this session and being removed from everything he'd built. And somewhere inside Blackthorne Hall, a man was waiting for her to come back. 2 words. No ornamentation. Come back. She looked at Malrek Blackthorne across the lantern light, and she made the only choice that was still available to her, the choice that was not cautious and not procedural and not the kind of thing a woman in her position was supposed to make. She reached inside her coat, pulled out the ledger, and held it where Malrek could see it. His eyes locked onto it with the specific hunger of a man who had been looking for something for a very long time. His hand moved toward it. "Lord Malrek," she said, and her voice was completely level. "Before you take that, you should know that in approximately 5 hours, Lord Fenwick Eras is going to walk into that council session having read every document in a sealed case that left these grounds 20 minutes ago." She held his gaze. "Every transaction, every forged debt, every land seizure, every name, including the chief magistrate's." She paused. "The ledger in my hand is the origin document, the one that closes the chain." She looked at him. "You can take it, and Eris still walks in with everything else. And the first question he asks in that session is why the origin document is missing." The lantern light threw shadows across Malrek's face. For the first time in their very brief acquaintance, she watched him recalculate. "Or," she said, "you let me walk back into that house, and we find out in 6 hours what a council session looks like when the people in the room already know the truth." The silence on the frozen road was total. Malrek looked at the ledger, looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not expected. Not defeat, not capitulation, but the specific expression of a man who had just identified a variable he had not accounted for and was deciding, in real time, how dangerous it actually was. He straightened in the saddle, looked past her toward the estate road, and said, to no one in particular, in the quiet voice of a man filing information, "The Eris rider. He came from the south approach." She understood, in the cold space between one heartbeat and the next, what his eyes had just found over her shoulder. She turned. The advance rider had not made it to the road. He was sitting on his horse 20 yards behind her, the sealed case visible in his hands, held by 2 of Malrek's men, who had come from the opposite direction. From the east, not the west, from a position that had been placed before Malrek had come to find her at all. Not one net. 2. He had anticipated the south path. He had anticipated the advance rider. He had anticipated everything. The case was back in Malrek's possession before she had turned fully around to face him again. In 6 hours, the council session would open. The magistrate would sit in his chair. The procedural authority would belong to a man who had just reclaimed the only document that could prove what he was. And Caedric Blackthorne, Duke of Blackthorne Dominion, was inside his own house surrounded by 7 people who reported to his enemy, waiting for a woman who was standing in the dark with nothing left but the original ledger, a name she had used for the first time 4 hours ago, and the specific knowledge that the man inside those walls had said come back to her with the directness of someone who had stopped having anything left to lose. Malric held out his hand. "The ledger, Your Grace," he said. "If you don't mind." She did not hand it over. Not immediately. She stood in the lantern light with the ledger against her chest and looked at Malric Blackthorne's outstretched hand and understood, in the specific cold clarity of someone who has run out of tactical options and arrived at the place where only character remains, that the next thing she did would define everything that came after it. The sealed case was gone. Reclaimed. Malric's second net had been tighter than his first, and she had walked into it because she hadn't known it existed, which was the specific penalty for underestimating a patient man. Not that he moved faster, but that he had already moved before you started counting. His hand was still extended. She looked at it, and then she opened the ledger. Not to hand it over, to read from it, out loud. "March 14th, she said, her voice carrying in the cold air with the particular clarity that came from years of reading accounts aloud to a father whose eyes had begun failing before his mind did. Tenant collection, Harrow Parcels, East Quarter, recorded 60 marks. Actual collection per secondary ledger, 91 marks. Differential, 31 marks, transferred to administrative trust account under authorization signature M. Blackthorne." Malric's hand dropped. "April 2nd, she continued, debt proceeding, Vale family, Kalen's Cross." She looked up from the page, met his eyes. "Oh, that one you'll remember personally." The rider nearest Malric's left hand shifted in his saddle. She heard it without looking at it. She was watching Malric's face, watching the specific recalculation happening behind his composed exterior, the reassessment of a man who had expected capitulation and was receiving something else entirely. "You're reading a document in a field," he said, "at night, to no one." "I'm reading it to you," she said, "and to your riders, and to the groundskeeper you've been holding since this evening, who has now heard the March 14th entry and the April 2nd entry, and will have heard several more by the time you decide to stop me." She turned a page. "May 19th. Take it from her," Malric said. One of the riders dismounted. She kept reading, louder, not panicked, the specific loudness of someone who understood that the value of what she was doing was not in the reading itself, but in the fact of it, the irrefutability of a thing that had been heard by multiple people simultaneously and could not be unheard. The rider reached her. She closed the ledger and held it against her chest with both arms, and looked at the rider with the flat, direct gaze of a woman who had been standing in cold fields fighting for things that mattered since before she could properly articulate what mattered meant. "Your name," she said to the rider. He stopped. "Your name," she said again. "You have one. You were born somewhere. Someone knows you. When the tribunal opens in—" She glanced toward the eastern sky, where the dark was beginning to consider becoming something else. 4 hours, your name will either be on the right side of the record or it won't, but it will be on a record, because everything that happens in the next 60 seconds is being witnessed by a man who works for the Duke of this dominion and has been held against his will by the Duke's uncle." She looked at Harson. Harson, who had been standing between Malric's men since she'd first seen him, with his face controlled and his hands at his sides. Harson, who had worked for Caedric for 22 years, and whose loyalty was not the performed kind, but the kind that had been tested and held. Harson looked at the rider. The rider looked at the ledger. Malric said very quietly, "Enough." And behind him, from the direction of the estate road, came the sound of a horse moving at speed. Not multiple horses. One. Moving with the specific urgency of someone who had been covering ground fast for a sustained period and had not slowed for the lantern light ahead. The horse came out of the dark and stopped hard, and the man on it was not a rider she recognized. He was travel-worn, his coat carrying the specific dust of a long approach from the north, and at his chest he wore the insignia of Lord Fenwick Eris. Not the advance rider Malric's men had intercepted, a second rider. She understood before he spoke. Eris had sent 2. "I carry correspondence for the Duke of Blackthorne," the rider said, to no one and everyone, in the carrying voice of a man trained to deliver messages in contested spaces. And I carry a copy of a sealed evidence package received by Lord Eris at the northern posting station 2 hours ago. He reached into his coat, produced a document. Lord Eris requests that this copy be delivered to every council member currently in transit before the dawn session. He is doing so himself with the original. A pause. He asked me to convey that he considers the contents a matter of dominion-wide significance. The silence on the frozen road was the kind that happened after something irreversible. Malrek's horse moved beneath him, one restless step, and he controlled it without looking down, his eyes on the rider, on the document, on the specific shape of a plan that had just encountered the variable it hadn't accounted for. Not one advance rider. 2. Because Eris, who had lost a cousin to a manufactured debt proceeding and had never been able to prove why, had spent 4 years developing the specific caution of a man who knew the roads in this dominion were not always safe for important correspondence. Lysandra looked at Malrec Blackthorne's face in the lantern light. She watched him absorb it. Not collapse. He was too old and too disciplined for collapse. But absorb it, the way a structure absorbed a load it had not been designed for. The specific internal redistribution of a man who was recalculating whether the position he had spent 17 years building was still tenable. She watched him decide that it was not. The hand that had been extended for the ledger dropped entirely. He looked at her across the lantern light, at the frost on her coat and the ledger against her chest, and the steadiness of her hands, and for the first time in their brief acquaintance, she saw in his face something that was not strategy. Just a man, very old in his particular war, looking at the thing that had ended it. "You should go inside," he said. Very quiet. Not a threat. Something almost like the recognition one adversary extended to another when the contest was settled. "It's cold." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back toward Blackthorne Hall. Harson fell into step beside her without being told. Neither of them spoke. Bashim. Caedric was in the entry hall when she came through the door. He was not pacing. He was standing near the base of the staircase with his coat still on and his hands at his sides, in the specific stillness of a man who had decided that movement would not help anything and had chosen stillness as the more honest expression of waiting. The household was quiet around him. The 7 staff members who reported to Malrec were presumably aware that the situation had shifted, but awareness of a shift and the ability to respond to it were different things. He looked at her when she came through the door, at the frost, at the ledger still in her hands, at Harson behind her. She crossed the entry hall and held the ledger out to him. He took it, looked at it, then looked at her face with the direct, undeflected attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. "The case," he said. Malrec took it. "But Eris sent 2 riders." She paused. "He has a copy. He's delivering originals to the council delegations himself." Caedric was quiet for a moment. "A copy," he said. "Eris is careful," she said. "Has been for years." He looked at the ledger in his hands, then back at her. "You read from it," he said. "In the field." She had not told him that. "Harson heard me." Caedric looked at Harson. Harson said simply, "Several entries. March and April specifically, and the names attached." Something moved across Caedric's face, not the fast, suppressed thing she had seen before. Something slower and more deliberate. The expression of a man consciously allowing himself to feel something he had spent a long time not permitting. "Go get warm," he said to her. Not a command. The specific gentleness of a man who only had one register for most things and was visibly operating outside it. "I'll find you before the session opens." She didn't move immediately. "Caedric," she said. "The 7 staff members." "I know. Tonight changed what they're holding. Malrec's position before dawn is not what it was 2 hours ago, and they'll know that. Some of them will." "I know," he said again, quieter. "I've been thinking about what to do with people who chose wrong when choosing wrong was the safer option." He held her gaze. "The answer is different depending on how wrong and why. That's tomorrow's work." She looked at him, at the man who had spent 17 years making enemies pay precisely and completely for what they'd done, and who was already, before the dust had settled, thinking about degrees of culpability, about whether every person on the wrong side of a thing was there by the same mechanism. That was new in him. She was not certain he knew it was new. She went upstairs. The council session opened at dawn in the Great Hall of Blackthorne Hall. 41 people sat in the tiered seating that had been arranged by tradition for exactly this kind of proceeding. Landowners, council members, estate officials, visiting magistrates from 3 neighboring jurisdictions who had been summoned under Section 14 and had arrived to find, waiting in their pre-dawn accommodations, a sealed document delivered by the personal rider of Lord Fenwick Arras. Lysandra sat beside Caedric at the central table. She had not been asked to. She had come down and taken the chair, and he had looked at her for 1 second and said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Malric sat across the hall in the council chair, silver-haired and composed, with the particular self-possession of a man who had not yet fully recalibrated his expectations for the morning. Lady Seraphine Ashcroft sat to his left, elegant and watchful, her eyes moving across the room with the specific attention of someone reading a situation that was not resolving the way she had anticipated. The chief magistrate, whose name was Aldous Crane, sat at the adjudication table with his hands folded and his face professionally neutral, and he had not yet opened the session because 3 of the council members had not yet taken their seats, and the 3 council members who had not yet taken their seats were Arras, Marsh, and Hale, who were standing near the hall's east entrance in a cluster with the quality of people who have recently read something significant and are still in the process of deciding what to do with it. Crane called the session to order at the 7th hour. Malric rose to present the emergency petition. He was 4 sentences into it when Arras spoke. "Before Lord Malric continues," Arras said from his seat, with the specific calm of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was saying it exactly as prepared, "I'd like to enter a document into the session record. Under council procedure, any member may enter relevant documentation before proceedings close." Crane looked at him. "The session has only just—" "Precisely," Arras said. "It's open. I'm entering documentation." He stood, held up the sealed package. Opened now, its contents visible, multiple documents stacked with the density of years. Evidence of systematic fraud conducted against tenant families across Blackthorne Dominion over a period of 12 years, forged debt instruments, fraudulent land transfers, manufactured collection proceedings, authorized at every stage by signatures I am prepared to name on the record. The room's quality changed, not loudly. The way rooms changed when the thing everyone had been circling finally appeared in the center. Malric said, "Any documentation submitted outside proper evidentiary procedure is inadmissible under—" "Lord Malric," Marsh said from the other side of the room, "I have a cousin who lost his estate 4 years ago to a debt proceeding. I was never able to explain. His name appears in that documentation." A pause. "I'd like an explanation." Seraphine Ashcroft put her hand flat on the table in front of her, a gesture that was identical, Lysandra noted distantly, to the gesture she herself made when she needed an anchor. She filed that away. The way the powerful and the powerless reached for the same physical certainty when the ground moved. Crane said, "The session will come to order." Nobody came to order. Caedric had not spoken. He sat beside her with his hands on the table and let the room run, which was a specific kind of strategy. Not silence as absence, but silence as the space in which other people's positions became visible. She watched him watch the room and understood that he had been doing this for 17 years, reading the texture of loyalty and self-interest and genuine outrage, and calculating where each one would land when the structure that had been holding them in place began to shift. It was shifting now. Crane called for order 3 more times. On the 4th, Caedric stood. The room went quiet. Not because he raised his voice, because he stood, and standing was enough. And the quality of attention that followed him, like weather followed a pressure system, moved through the hall and settled into silence before he opened his mouth. "The session stands," he said. "Under Dominion law, with full council present, I am exercising my authority as Duke to expand the scope of this proceeding from an emergency petition review to a full evidentiary tribunal." He looked at Crane. "The chief magistrate will continue to preside. His name appears in the documentation Lord Arras has submitted, which means the tribunal will evaluate that documentation and determine whether his continued role as adjudicator is appropriate." A pause. "That is not a prejudgment. It is a procedural acknowledgement. The council will vote on whether to proceed." Malric said, You cannot unilaterally expand. Call the vote, Caedric said. Not loud, absolute. He sat back down. The vote was called. It was not unanimous. Malric's 7 council allies voted against. 3 others abstained, which was its own form of information about where they expected the morning to end. The remaining 31 voted to proceed. The tribunal opened. Bammacht. What followed lasted 4 hours. Lysandra presented her father's ledger personally, as she had agreed to do, standing at the central table in a room full of people, half of whom had dismissed her as inconsequential, and half of whom were revising that assessment in real time. She read the key entries. She explained the methodology her father had used, the specific way a meticulous man documented discrepancies without drawing attention to the documentation. She answered questions from Eras and Marsh and Hale with the directness of someone who had spent 6 months living inside the numbers and knew them the way she knew her own name. Malric's advocate challenged her credibility 4 times. The first time, she answered with the specific entry that corresponded to the challenge's implied timeline. The second time, she answered with her father's employment record, which she had memorized. The third time, she looked at the advocate and said, "My father kept these records for 3 years at significant personal risk because he understood that the people who build systems of harm rely on the people who see it staying quiet. I am not staying quiet. You can challenge my background, my marriage, my motives, and my age. None of those things change what's written on these pages." The fourth time, Eris said, before she could answer, "I've reviewed this documentation for 3 hours. Her account of it is accurate to the page. Move on." Crane's role in the scheme was the hardest moment in the room, not because it was contested, but because it wasn't. When Marsh held up the authorization signatures and read Crane's name aloud for the record, the chief magistrate sat at his adjudication table with his hands folded and said nothing, which was the specific silence of a man who had looked at his position and understood it was no longer defensible. He resigned from the session before the noon hour. Malrec lasted longer. He was good, genuinely, formidably good, in the way that patient, intelligent people were good at the things they had spent their lives practicing. He challenged procedure. He challenged chain of custody. He challenged the legality of the expanded tribunal scope. He reframed, repositioned, redirected with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent 60 years making himself untouchable. He ran out of room at the 3rd hour, when Hale presented her own 3 years of parallel documentation, irregular land transfers on her estate's border, patterns she had recorded without a framework to understand them, and placed it beside Aldrich Vale's ledger, and the combined record made the pattern so clear that challenging any individual piece of it became irrelevant. You could not argue with a pattern that complete. Seraphine Ashcroft asked to speak. She stood with the composure of a woman who had spent years in rooms like this and understood that composure, at this stage, was the only currency with any remaining value. "I want to be clear," she said, "about the degree of my direct involvement versus my awareness of the mechanism." She looked at the council, not at Malrec. "Those are different things. And I am prepared to specify the difference in full, with documentation, in exchange for a considered rather than summary judgment." Malrec looked at her from across the hall with an expression she did not look back at. The council voted on that too. What? The session ended at the early afternoon. The formal findings were not delivered that day. They would require a week of official documentation, counterpetition periods, and the administrative work of dismantling what had been built over 12 years. But the shape of the outcome was clear in the room before the final vote was called, the way the shape of weather was clear before the storm arrived. Malrec Blackthorne was escorted from the hall by Dominion guards. He walked without resistance, which was either the dignity of a man accepting a verdict or the specific self-possession of someone who was already calculating the next position. She watched him go and could not entirely determine which, and decided that not knowing was acceptable. Some people were not transformed by their own downfall. Some people simply recalculated. What mattered was that his calculation no longer had access to the machinery it had been running. Crane's office was sealed pending investigation. Ashcroft's cooperation negotiation was ongoing. The 7 household staff members were interviewed individually. 4 of them, it emerged, had been operating under varying degrees of coercion rather than conviction, Positions leveraged, family members threatened, the specific methods of someone who understood that most people did not choose the wrong side freely, but were maneuvered there. Those four were reassigned rather than dismissed, which was a decision that cost Caedric something in terms of how it read publicly, and which he made anyway. The other three left the estate before dark. Bob. She found him in the library at dusk. The same room. The fire rebuilt, the room warm, the recess behind the bookshelf standing open and empty now. Documents all submitted, the years of parallel record finally serving the purpose they had been built for. He was standing at the window looking out over the grounds in the specific way of someone who has been in motion for a very long time and has just stopped and is adjusting to the quality of stillness. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He turned. They had been in the same room for most of 12 hours, sitting side by side through 4 hours of tribunal, moving through the same corridors and decisions and moments. And this was somehow the first time since the night before that they were simply in the same space without an emergency requiring the space between them. He looked tired, not depleted. This was not a man who depleted easily, but underneath the controlled bearing, underneath the 17 years of practiced impenetrability, something had shifted in his face since the morning. Something that had been held at permanent tension had been released, and the release had left him different. Not softer exactly, but more present. More accurately himself, the way a building looked more like what it actually was when the scaffolding finally came down. "Your father," he said. "I want him moved here, when he's well enough. There are rooms on the south wing with better light." She looked at him. "That's not what you were going to say." A pause. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the fire. The same chair as the night before. And he sat across from her in the same position, and the symmetry of it was not lost on either of them. "What were you going to say?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work against 17 years of the specific habit of not saying the true thing. The habit that forms in people who have learned that saying the true thing is a vulnerability, and vulnerability is something others used as a weapon. "I was going to say," he said at last, "that when I went to Kalen's Cross, I told myself I was going for the ledger. For the evidence. For the strategic position." He held her gaze. "And that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. What was the rest of it?" He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the end table when she had told him she wanted the terms in writing. That direct, complete attention that was so different from the way most people looked at things they were uncertain about. "I'd read your father's record," he said. "The official one. What he did. How he did it. 3 years of documenting something that could have destroyed him, quietly, without protection, because he understood it was the right thing to do, and he didn't know who else was going to do it." A pause. "I wanted to know the family that produced that." She looked at the fire. In it she saw her father's face the way it had looked the night the fever broke and his mind had cleared, pressed and certain and frightened in the specific way of someone handing over something they had been carrying alone for too long. She thought about what it had cost him, what it had cost her. The 2 years of ruin, the cottage, the debt collectors at dawn, the slow grinding machinery of a system designed to make sure people like them never accumulated enough leverage to matter. She thought about what it had produced. "He would have found this funny," she said. Caedric looked at her. "My father," she said, "that his ledger ended up here, in a tribunal, in front of 41 people." She almost smiled, and the almost was its own kind of warmth. He was a very quiet man. He didn't think of himself as brave. He thought of himself as accurate. She paused. He just couldn't stop writing down what was true. "Accuracy is a form of bravery," Caedric said, "when the truth is inconvenient enough." She looked at him. He said it without performance, without the managed register of a man making a statement. Just the flat, honest voice of someone who had spent 17 years working beside the specific inconvenience of truth and had arrived at a clear-eyed understanding of what it cost. The fire moved between them. Outside, the grounds of Blackthorne Hall were settling into the particular quiet of an evening after something large had passed through. The quality of air after a storm, when the world was still assessing its own condition. Somewhere in the Dominion, On estates whose names were in the ledger, tenant families were living their ordinary evenings without yet knowing that the machinery that had been operating against them had been shut down. That knowledge would arrive through official channels slowly, over the weeks of administrative work that followed a proceeding like this. The restoration of land, the cancellation of fraudulent debts, the formal acknowledgement that what had been done to them had been done wrongly and would be undone. It would not give back the years. Nothing gave back years, but it would give back the ground. Caedric looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had signed documents, held power, managed a dominion, and had just today signed the orders that began dismantling what his own bloodline had built inside his walls. There was a specific reckoning in a man who had prided himself on control, discovering that control had been compromised at the root. She had watched him absorb it across 12 hours of tribunal without letting it show, and she understood what that absorption had cost him. Not the political cost, which was calculable, but the deeper cost, the one that lived in a person's relationship with their own judgment. "You couldn't have known," she said, "about your uncle, about the magistrate, about the depth of it." "I should have moved sooner," he said, "moving sooner without the chain closed." "I know the argument," he said. "I made it myself for 4 months." He looked at her. Knowing the argument is correct doesn't resolve what it feels like to have been outmaneuvered inside your own house for 17 years. She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It doesn't." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she saw in them something she had not seen in Kaelin's cross across the inn table, something that had been there briefly in the moments between the specific expression of a man who had found, at the end of a very long fight, that the thing standing beside him was not a strategic asset or a procedural necessity. It was a person who had read him accurately, who had walked 3 miles in the dark without being asked, who had stood in a frozen field and read from a ledger out loud because it was the only thing left to do, and had done it with the specific groundedness of someone who understood that what they were doing mattered more than whether it succeeded. "I owe you a debt," he said. "No," she said, "you don't." "Lysandra, debts are what this whole thing was built on," she said. "Manufactured ones, real ones. The idea that everything between people is a ledger." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want a debt. I don't want a transaction." A pause. "I want to know whether what's happening in this house is something real or something we performed under pressure and will spend the next 6 months dismantling." The silence between them had the texture of something that had been waiting to be asked. He did not answer immediately. She did not expect him to. He was not a man who answered immediately when the answer mattered. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "Whatever this is. I've spent 17 years making sure nothing inside these walls could be used against me, which means I've spent 17 years making sure nothing inside these walls was real." He held her gaze without flinching from what he was saying. "I don't know how to stop doing that overnight." "I know," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one." She looked at him. "I don't know how to live in a house like this. I don't know how to be a duchess. I don't know how to navigate what comes after a tribunal that just named half the Dominion's administration as corrupt." She paused. "We're both starting from somewhere we've never been." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant amount of not knowing," he said. "Yes." "For 2 people running a dominion." "Yes." Something shifted in his face. The shadow of the thing that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. The expression she had catalogued from the first day in the inn and had been reading differently each time she saw it. This time it reached further, was less shadow and more the thing itself. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "All right," he said again, and this time it was not the word he used when he accepted a strategic position. It was the word he used when he accepted something he couldn't fully calculate, for reasons that exceeded calculation. Outside, the last light was leaving the grounds of Blackthorne Hall. The gates that had closed behind her carriage 4 days ago stood at the edge of the darkening, iron and old, built to keep things out and keep things in, built in a time when the difference had seemed straightforward. She looked at them through the window. She thought about what it meant to be inside a place that had been used as a weapon against everyone who couldn't breach its walls, and to be here now in the aftermath of the breach, in the specific quiet of a house that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, what it meant to be something other than fortress. Some things could not be rebuilt overnight. Some damage was years in the making and would be years in the repair. The tenant families whose names were in the ledger would receive their lands back through processes that would take months, administered by systems that would need to be rebuilt from the root. The Dominion's trust in its own institutions would take longer. Trust always took longer than the thing that broke it. But the ground was there, solid and real, and no longer owned by the wrong people. She pressed her palm flat on the table, felt the wood grain. The anchor she kept finding in this house, in this room, at this table. Caedric looked at her hand on the table. Then he put his hand beside it. Not on top of it. Beside it, the way you place something next to something else when you were acknowledging its presence without trying to possess it. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the gates of Blackthorne Hall stood open to the evening. Not because someone had ordered them open, but because in the business of the day, in the moving of people and documents and decisions, no one had thought to close them. And in that small, accidental openness, something that had been sealed for 17 years breathed its first unguarded breath. The most powerful force in the Dominion, it turned out, was not the Duke's title or his iron-handed authority or the walls he had built so carefully around everything he controlled. It was the specific, unguarded moment when a very armored man chose to put his hand beside someone else's. And meant it.